What is history but a fable agreed upon? Those were the words of Napoleon Bonaparte 200 years ago, and that astute observation holds just as true today. Thanks for joining me, Michael, your host here at Pyramids and Prehistory, on our quest to cut through the conventional facade of the fable that is so-called conventional ancient history, and gather the astounding geological, astronomical, archaeological, and anthropological evidence that proves ultra-advanced worldwide human civilization existed on Earth in so-called prehistory. And, contrary to what we've been taught, these geographically distant cultures were in fact tied together through trade, colonization, and conquest. Are you ready for the truth that history books are afraid to tell you? So, let's dive deep into pyramids and prehistory. How old is civilization? There are those who would have us believe that civilization goes back a mere 6,000 years, 4,000 years BC more or less at the time of the Sumerians, or perhaps the ancient Egyptians, or the Hindu civilization in India, or perhaps even the Chinese. But the reality is that civilization is much, much older than that. In fact, civilization began nearly 12,000 years ago. What happened? We're going to find out right now. It has been one of history's great unexplained and nonsensical mysteries as to the origins of the so-called Neolithic Revolution in the year 9600 BC. This revolution engendered the oldest known beer brewing vats, wheat cultivation, ceramics, metal usage, smelting, terrazzo mortar floors, cosmetics, winemaking, animal husbandry, and etc. This year of beginnings of civilization and megalithic construction coincides with the cataclysmic end of the Younger Dryas period, obviously a huge impediment to progress in and of itself. In fact, an advanced worldwide civilization was wiped off the face of the earth and then had to be rebooted shortly prior to an incredible 11,600 years before present. The details of that unforgettable event, which has scarred mankind's collective memory ever since, is the subject of a video and podcast which can be linked to in the comments. The other problem being that this technology seemingly emerged from nowhere, with zero previous knowledge to explain its creation. This site, doubtless founded in a transfer of knowledge by a surviving high civilization, was Göbekli Tepe. Shortly after the Extinction Level Event of 9600 BC, a few of its survivors found a landing place at what would later become the ancient hamlet of Nisir in the lofty Ararat region of Turkey, ancient Urartu in the Syrian texts. From there, these survivors would have migrated some 700 miles southeast, down high Turkish plains abundant in plants and animals and replete with rivers and lakes. They eventually settled 9 miles, 15 kilometers, northeast of the present-day town of Sanliurfa, also in Turkey, which is located at 37 degrees, 13 minutes, 23 degrees north by 38 degrees, 55 minutes, 21 seconds east, very near the northern Syrian border. Founding the world's first megalithic city, Göbekli Tepe dated precisely once again immediately after the flood, 9600 BC. The ruins of the once thriving temple and city, founded by the probable descendants of Shem, chosen son of Noah, we have come to call Göbekli Tepe, pot-bellied hill in Turkish. Indeed, according to Jewish tradition, Shem and his offspring were reputed to have peopled exactly this part of southeastern Turkey, Sumeria, Israel, and Arabia. But why was Shem chosen to accomplish such a crucial undertaking as the literal reboot of civilization at Göbekli Tepe? According to some Jewish sources, Shem was the first prophet after Noah. His wisdom is further corroborated by Sumerian records, which state specifically that Noah gave all scientific, medicinal, mathematical, astronomical, and other knowledge to his chosen son Shem. And as per ancient Sumerian text, corroborated by later Assyrian, Jewish, and Islamic texts, we know that Shem and his clan settled this specific region of the Tigris, Euphrates, and later Sumeria itself. Who better, indeed, to play a major role as foreman, perhaps, in the reboot of civilization in precisely this region? But why was this region special specifically? Firstly, Göbekli Tepe was constructed atop a 50-foot mound, itself at a flood-safe altitude of 2,500 feet, or 760 meters, of altitude. Also being near the foot of Kaligadada volcano, the soil was mineral-rich, which would prove to be crucial, as we shall see shortly. Also conveniently nearby are large quantities of basalt, a favored building block in many monolithic structures worldwide. Furthermore, the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verses 10 to 14, lists 4 rivers in association with the Garden of Eden, also called the Eden in Sumerian text: the Pishon, Gihon, Hiddekel, the Tigris, and Firat, the Euphrates. Their common area of confluence forming the Dilmun region associated with Sumerian accounts of the Eden. and which is very near Göbekli Tepe. In short, there are many reasons for Göbekli Tepe to have been built where it was. 1. Location in the general vicinity of the Eden, traditional location of the original creation of man. 2. Relative proximity to the Ararat region, where Noah and his family found a refuge after the flood. 3. Being a region peopled by Shem, the first post-flood prophet and retainer of the wisdom of his father Noah. 4. A fairly high altitude, not prone to normal flooding. 5. A rich volcanic soil appropriate for farming. And 6. Availability of basalt, favored material for building monolithic sites. So exactly what was the nature of civilization's reboot, and how was it finally discovered after having been lost to mankind for over 11,000 years? And just how can we be certain this monumental discovery in Turkey is truly the seeding of the cradle of civilization in the East, and not precisely the Sumerians of Iraq, as we've been taught for almost 200 years? We're about to find out. But first, I'd really like to know what you think about what skills so-called Neolithic man must have had to build the largest and oldest monolithic settlement known to us, and if they could have done it with just the help of their fellow hunter-gatherers, or was there an injection of knowledge and know-how coming from somewhere else? What do you think? Please comment below. I'd love to hear from you. And while you're here, if you're getting some value from this content so far, take the chance and go ahead and like and subscribe. Click that like button and also ring the bell so you'll be the first to know when we have new content. Thanks. The large so-called pot-bellied hill of Göbekli Tepe near the town of Şanlıurfa had long been under agricultural cultivation by locals. And in 1963, some upper parts of the T-shaped pillars were first noted in a survey by Istanbul University and the University of Chicago. However, they were mistaken for a Byzantine cemetery and subsequently forgotten or ignored for some 30 years. But in 1994, German archaeologist and prehistorian Klaus Schmidt surmised the true importance of Göbekli Tepe after reviewing the 1963 Chicago researcher's brief description of Göbekli Tepe and his having inspected artifacts found by a local farmer while cultivating the local land. Dr. Schmidt later stated, and I quote, "I knew that if I didn't walk away immediately, I would be here for the rest of my life," unquote. This was indeed true, as geophysical surveys proved the site to be immense both in size and importance. To date, 4 main enclosures have been disinterred of an estimated 20. Only 10% has been uncovered so far, about 60 monolithic stones of an estimated 200, detected through ground-penetrating radar. These upright T-shaped stone monoliths average 20 feet or 6 meters in height, 10 to 15 tons weight each. The enclosures they form are elliptical in shape. Their quarry was found less than a mile from there with a partially chiseled stone that is a staggering 50 tons in size, 7 meters by 3 meters. It's a huge complex, and 50 times more of Göbekli Tepe has yet to be uncovered. Infrared technology therefore confirming it to be not only the largest by far of any other megalithic complex on Earth, but also the very oldest, about 6,000 years more ancient than the hitherto presumed dawn of civilization, the Sumerians. But by whom was such an immense and difficult construction undertaken? Prior to its sudden appearance in Turkey, there was nothing at that site except a hunter-gatherer culture. The original blueprint of this reboot, Göbekli Tepe, was likely from an influx of displaced peoples from other parts of the world. From where is not certain. And interestingly, the styles in Göbekli Tepe have more in common with megalithic structures in Central and South America than they do with other parts of the world in the general vicinity. Sumer, Babylon, Indian, etc. It bears remembering that Göbekli Tepe is 11,600 years old, 9,600 BC, coinciding shortly after the date, according to Plato's Athenian forebear Solon the lawgiver, that Atlantis, and I quote Solon, was swallowed up by flood, fire, and earthquake in a single day and night, unquote. The subsequent founding of a huge megalithic complex attests to a surviving advanced group of settlers coming from nowhere after the advance of floodwaters and constructing the very first megalithic structures, Göbekli Tepe, at the tail end of the Younger Dryas, after the subsidence of the torrential rains and resulting worldwide deluge of the post-Younger Dryas. Indeed, author and explorer Andrew Collins cites cataclysmophobia as being a predominant element in the persistent construction of megalithic structures at the blueprint, Göbekli Tepe, and subsequently worldwide, in apparent fear that if they didn't build massively, their culture would once again disappear with the next cataclysmic event. Tellingly, the founding date of Göbekli Tepe is very shortly after what has been verified to be Noah's Ark landing in the nearby region of Ararat, also in Turkey, in 9,600 BC. As a side note, if you'd like to know more of the last extinction level event that ended a flourishing prehistoric civilization, click the link here. But if you care to skip ahead to his companion video podcast of the fascinating story of how the Ark was found and authenticated, click the other link here. In sharp contrast to the popularly held belief proposed in the 1920s by Gordon Childe and adhered to until the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in 1994, megalithic monuments and centers of worship were not developed after the advent of agriculture gave them more time to construct such things. Rather, the need to feed the thousands of laborers, engineers, artisans, pilgrims, and shamans of the largest megalithic city, Göbekli Tepe, necessitated advanced agricultural improvements to feed them. In the words of site discoverer and prehistoric archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, and I quote, "First came the temple, then the city," unquote. Because after the building of the site, agriculture suddenly appears, an obvious transfer of technology, as hunter-gatherers would know nothing of agriculture. Wheat for making meal, bread, and beer would have been a staple necessary to feed such masses of people in this agricultural revolution. And it has been proven that 68 strains of the modern wheat used by humans today can all be traced back to within 50 miles of Göbekli Tepe, the fertile soil at the foot of an extinct volcano and mountain range, Kaligada Da, visible on the horizon from Göbekli Tepe. It's clear the site was founded by an elite class called the Watchers, likely shamans who controlled the spiritual destiny of the people in passing from this world to the next, as it's apparent that the site was used by initiates as a sort of intermediary place between the natural world of everyday life and the mystical world, or portal between the scientific and arcane world of knowledge. But just how were these mysterious shamans able to organize and mobilize hunter-gatherers and any ragtag educated survivors of the recent extinction level event in this massive undertaking? The answer when we come back after this short break. Some of the Watchers are described as being albinos with long faces. Similar legends of Iran call these architects of Göbekli Tepe the Immortals, and others call them the Shining Ones, or even Anunnaki. They are also mentioned as Nephilim in the book of Genesis, and in the book of Enoch were remembered as the Anunnaki, or gods of heaven and earth, which was originally Anuni, or the sky people. Sumerian tales recount the Eden as being north of the Tigris-Euphrates at a place called Dilmun, which is still associated with the Göbekli Tepe area of southeast Turkey. The Akkadian and Sumerian kings believed themselves to have been descended from the Watchers, builders of Dilmun, or Eden. This was the original Dilmun, or Eden, where, according to both Sumerian sources and the apocryphal book of Enoch, the Anunnaki lived in a mountain within the Eden, unquote. As a note, this is not to be confused with the latter so-called Dilmun civilization of the faraway island of Bahrain off the Arabian Peninsula, a name which was meant to echo the original Paradise Lost, but was in fact a much later trading port, not a mountain paradise stronghold of the gods. But how do we know with such precision the exact date of the founding of civilization's first post-Diluvian civilization, the one from which all other cultures sprouted? Firstly, the date has been established through A, flint and obsidian tools found on site, and B, radiocarbon dating from organic matter retrieved from the enclosure. The oldest structures at Göbekli Tepe were built between 9,600 to 9,400 BC. The other parts were built gradually over a period of 1,500 years, terminating about 8,000 BC, at which point it was deliberately covered up with care, thus preserving its artifacts from being mixed with earlier or later civilizations. Secondly, this date has been confirmed through astronomical data, and indeed astronomical considerations were at the very core of the Göbekli Tepe temple complex's construction and usage. Clearly, quite a bit of astronomical detective work was needed to reverse engineer the logic behind precisely which of the star constellations the shaman priests were observing through the star sighting holes bored into the megalithic centerpiece, the twin T-pillar portal, in order to further corroborate the radiocarbon dating of the pottery and the artifacts found buried on site. But just which stars were the priests, shamans, or watchers observing? That would depend on the direction one presumed the builders of Göbekli Tepe had used as a focus, north-northwest or south-southeast. When checked, the alignments of the southerly constellations at the time of building and usage, 9,600 to 8,000 BC, were found to have been possibly Orion, Hyades, Sirius, Taurus, Vela, and the Southern Cross. The closest near match of the southerly view was Orion, but upon close examination it was found Orion wouldn't have been visible through any sort of real alignment with the twin T-pillar portal at the time of Göbekli Tepe's use. Therefore, checking the northerly direction for possible twin T-pillar alignments, the constellations that could possibly align would be Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, Cepheus, Hercules, Draco, and Cygnus. The only one that proved to make any sense in alignment, especially with the older sections C, D, and E, was the constellation Cygnus, with the precise alignment in the hold sighting stone between the twin T columns being the setting of the star Deneb, the brightest in that constellation. Alignment was precise between roughly 9,400 to about 8,900 BC. In the presumed oldest part, section D, the alignment falls precisely in the middle of what radiocarbon dating estimates to have been the building date of this section of Göbekli Tepe between 9,700 BC to 9,300 BC. Many of these stones are carved in high relief, and the stylized art is absolutely unique. The only similarities style-wise being in some prehistoric cave art, although the column high relief carvings are much more sophisticated. They include arachnids, aurochs, lizards, bulls, foxes, gazelles, reptiles, snakes, lions, birds, and vultures especially. We'll get back to the vulture or swan cult presently, as it's essential to understanding the true purpose of this very first beginning of post-flood humanity. The oldest part was erected with a foundation of bedrock at the summit of the hill, 760 meters altitude. All the surrounding soil was brought in from below, presumably from the plain, to cover the oldest section up. Newer sections were built on top of each previous buried section. The Watchers of Cygnus used Göbekli Tepe for 1,000 years as an apparent epicenter from which Western civilization could reestablish itself in terms of teaching agriculture, geometry, mathematics, and etc. to its native population of hitherto nomadic hunter-gatherers. During this millennium of use, each previous level and section of the site, sections A through F, was carefully and purposely buried in the artificial hill, apparently to leave it in the untouched and intact state in which it was subsequently rediscovered 10,000 years later. A message in stone preserved for eternity, as it were, for those wise enough to decipher the stone's complex true purpose. The sealing of this site 10,000 years ago, which prevented contamination from later cultures, is absolutely unique in that it allows a precise date to be established. But exactly why were the older complexes abandoned? The T-shaped columns represent a portal of transition between worlds. As confirmed by chartered engineer Rodney Hale, Andrew Collins' partner on numerous archaeological expeditions, twin T-pillar sets in the different compounds are facing a certain direction by design. Compound A and F are facing completely different directions, but in sections B, C, and D, they are facing north-northwest or south-southeast, depending on one's point of view. These three T-column sets are slightly askew of each other, suggesting that they were not used to observe sun, moon, or planetary movements, but rather a star which would rise on the south-southeast horizon and set on the north-northwest horizon. Over time, perhaps 150 or so years, the T-column sets would no longer align, as the star in question, the prominent star of the Cygnus constellation Deneb, would have been off due to its progression through the equinoxes. Therefore, a new set would be built to align with the destination the soul would travel on its journey to Cygnus. Further proof of this intentional alignment to face Deneb in Cygnus can be seen in the newer compound of Chayanu near Ergeni, which is 8,800 to 7,000 BC construction, which is a mere 50 miles from Göbekli Tepe. Its alignment matched the then coordinates of Deneb at that later date. The last phase of Göbekli Tepe was decommissioned about 8,000 BC, as there were by then other similar, if much smaller, centers of learning and worship in prehistoric eastern Turkey, such as sites Dawali Chori, Chianu, and so forth. And the architectural styles was likewise copied by later megalithic structures in Syria and northern Iraq. Interestingly, the largest and most sophisticated complex structure parts were the older ones. The simpler and smaller were the last ones, as if the sophistication of its builders had diminished, not increased, over the period of 1,500 years of the various complexes' use. Again, suggesting an initial cultural and technological injection of the highest quality, intriguingly at the very dawn of what we understand as civilization, 9,600 BC. Indeed, these subsequent offshoot megalithic constructions had become diluted by copycat constructors, gradually phasing out or forgetting to do the elaborate carvings on the T terminations of the stones. At some point, they devolved from T-shaped structures to being simply large, upright, monolithic stones arranged as best suited to their purpose, finally fizzling out altogether in this region before the rise of the hitherto presumed first high civilization of Sumeria, 6,000 years later. Incredibly, Göbekli Tepe is a full 6,000 years more ancient than the established dates of any other megalithic site known, for example the Sumerian ruins at Nineveh and Ur. To put that into perspective, the time that Göbekli Tepe is removed from its much later offshoot Sumeria is the same 6,000 years that we, in the 21st century, are removed from Sumeria itself, the civilization we had erroneously believed to have been the dawn of civilized man. Now we know the precise point of origin and date of the Neolithic Revolution that kick-started wheat cultivation, beer brewing, astronomy, ceramics, metal usage, advanced engineering, animal husbandry, and etc., coming from nowhere and occurring right after an extinction level event that destroyed civilization in the year 9600 BC. We have also seen how this date and region aligns closely with Noah's Ark and the location of the Garden of Eden. These subjects have been discussed at length in other of our videos and podcasts. Also mentioned briefly was the mysterious group of so-called gods and sages who inserted older and yet more advanced technology into the region, the architects of Göbekli Tepe, the Watchers of Cygnus. What remains to be revealed is the staggering secret behind the importance of the constellation Cygnus and its prominent star Deneb, one which is remembered as coded myth among world cultures even to this day, and ancient lore preserved for over 12,000 years by the priests of the original Watchers, or Anunnaki, the sky people. Join us for part 2 of this fascinating miniseries, The Watchers of the Cygnus Galactic Dark Rift. Up next, which you can enjoy by clicking on the appropriate link. I'd like to make it clear that I researched quite a few sources to be able to share the incredible story of how a few bedraggled survivors, with help, were able to literally reboot the advanced civilization which had perished shortly before. Besides the many resources I found on the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, Wikipedia, and several sources online, also cited here are details culled from extraordinary lectures, interviews by various renowned authors and explorers, especially Klaus Schmidt, Graham Hancock, and Andrew Collins. Links to their excellent channels or sites can be found in the comments section. Thank you, gentlemen, for your vast knowledge and inspiration.